A narcissist often becomes the most unpredictable at the exact moment they realize they no longer control your emotions. Most people expect them to walk away, accept the loss, forward, and disappear. Yet psychology suggests something very different. For many narcissistic personalities, losing emotional influence is not the end of the story. Forward. It is the beginning of a completely new phase, one that many people never see coming. That is why some people notice a strange shift. Forward. The person who ignored them suddenly becomes attentive. The one who seemed cold suddenly becomes emotional. The person who acted distant suddenly starts reaching out again. Forward. At first glance, it looks confusing. It can even look like love, regret, or personal growth. But beneath the surface, a very different psychological process may be unfolding. Forward. Most people misunderstand this moment. They think a narcissist only leaves when they stop caring. In reality, forward, many narcissistic individuals become more active when they sense that their influence is fading. The silence they once enjoyed suddenly feels uncomfortable. Forward. The emotional reactions they once expected begin to disappear. The control they relied on becomes uncertain. That uncertainty often changes everything. Forward. One of the biggest myths about narcissistic behavior is that anger is their greatest fear. It is not always anger. In many cases, forward, emotional indifference creates a much stronger reaction. Anger still shows emotional investment. Arguments still provide attention. Forward. Defending yourself still keeps the emotional connection alive. But genuine emotional detachment sends an entirely different message. Forward. It quietly communicates that their ability to affect your emotions is disappearing. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They expect dramatic endings. Forward. They wait for one final confrontation. They expect closure through a big conversation. Real life rarely works that way. The most important shift often happens silently. Forward. It happens inside your own mind. One day, the emotional grip begins to weaken. The constant need to explain yourself fades. The urge to prove your worth becomes smaller. Forward. The fear of losing the relationship slowly loses its power. Forward. From the outside, this change may seem almost invisible. But to someone who depends heavily on controlling emotional reactions, it can become surprisingly noticeable. Forward. Small changes in your behavior begin sending powerful signals. You reply less emotionally. You stop chasing approval. You no longer rush to defend yourself against accusations. Forward. You remain calm during situations that once triggered anxiety. These subtle changes often communicate far more than long emotional conversations ever could. Forward. Researchers who study narcissistic personality traits have found that many individuals with high levels of narcissism rely heavily on external validation to maintain a stable sense of self. Forward. Praise, admiration, attention, and emotional reactions can all become sources of psychological reinforcement. This does not mean every narcissistic person behaves in the same way. Forward. Human personalities are complex. Background, emotional maturity, life experiences, and individual differences all matter. Still, forward. Many psychologists recognize recurring patterns that appear again and again. One lesser-known fact surprises many people. Narcissistic behavior is not always driven by confidence. Forward. In fact, beneath the appearance of superiority, there can be an unusually fragile sense of self-worth. Forward. The confidence that others see may sometimes function more like armor than genuine security. Forward. That is why losing admiration or emotional influence can feel much more threatening than outsiders realize. This creates an interesting paradox. Forward. Someone who appears completely self-assured may become deeply unsettled when another person simply stops reacting. Not because they lost an argument, not because they were criticized, but because they suddenly lost the emotional feedback that helped reinforce their identity. Many people assume that manipulation always looks obvious. They expect shouting, insults, or dramatic emotional scenes. Sometimes those behaviors occur. Sometimes they do not. Manipulation can also appear as kindness that arrives unexpectedly. It can look like sudden generosity after months of neglect. It can sound like apologies that appear only after emotional distance has grown. It can even appear as concern that seems sincere on the surface while serving another purpose underneath. This is one reason so many people become confused. They start questioning their own judgment. They wonder whether the narcissist has finally changed. They begin second-guessing the progress they fought so hard to make. That confusion is often exactly where emotional control quietly returns. Understanding these patterns is not about judging people. It is about recognizing behaviors. Psychology focuses on patterns because patterns help explain why certain situations repeat themselves. They also help people make healthier decisions without becoming trapped in endless cycles of confusion. Another fact that many people never hear is that emotional independence often changes the entire relationship dynamic more than confrontation ever does. A long argument may produce temporary emotional release, but emotional detachment changes the balance itself. It removes the predictable reactions that once fueled the cycle. This does not mean becoming cold or cruel. It does not mean seeking revenge. It does not mean pretending that painful experiences never happened. Emotional detachment simply means that another person's approval, criticism, praise, or rejection no longer determines your inner peace. That difference is enormous. Ironically, many narcissistic individuals understand this shift before anyone else notices it. They pay close attention to changes in behavior. They notice when messages become shorter. They notice when emotional discussions stop producing the same reactions. They notice when guilt no longer works. They notice when fear begins to disappear. Those small behavioral changes often communicate something far more powerful than words. That realization can trigger a sequence of psychological stages. Each stage has its own purpose. Each stage creates new behaviors that often surprise the very person trying to move forward. Some responses appear caring, others become hostile. Some create hope, others create fear. Yet beneath many of these reactions lies one central goal: restoring emotional influence. This is why so many people feel pulled back into relationships they believed were finally ending. They mistake changing tactics for changing character. They interpret renewed attention as genuine transformation. Sometimes real personal growth is possible. People can change through deep self-awareness, accountability, and long-term therapeutic work. But lasting change requires much more than temporary shifts in behavior. Understanding that difference can protect someone from repeating painful cycles. Throughout this video, we will carefully examine what often happens when a narcissist realizes that your attention is fading, your emotional reactions are becoming smaller, and your need for their validation is disappearing. We will explore the psychological stages that frequently follow. We will explain why behavior suddenly changes, why some responses become more intense before they fade away, and why emotional detachment often creates stronger reactions than open conflict. Most importantly, forward, you will learn how recognizing these patterns can help you avoid being drawn back into unhealthy dynamics. Knowledge creates clarity. Clarity reduces confusion. Forward. And confusion is often the very thing that keeps unhealthy relationships alive. By the end of this video, you will understand why emotional freedom changes everything. Forward. Why the most dramatic reactions often appear after you stop seeking approval, and why the greatest shift does not happen inside the narcissist. It happens inside you. Forward. Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy exploring the psychology behind complex relationships and learning practical insights that help you protect your peace, forward, make sure to subscribe and join our community. Let us begin. Not caring anymore does not mean becoming cruel. It does not mean trying to win. It does not mean planning revenge. Forward. It also does not mean giving someone the silent treatment to make them chase you. Those actions still revolve around the other person. They are still emotional reactions. Forward. They still keep the connection alive. Real emotional detachment is very different. Forward. It begins quietly. One day, the need to explain yourself becomes weaker. The endless replaying of conversations starts to fade. Forward. The pressure to prove that you were right slowly disappears. Their praise feels less exciting. Their criticism hurts less than it once did. Forward. Their approval no longer feels necessary for your peace of mind. That change may seem small from the outside. Inside, it is enormous. Forward. Many people believe emotional detachment looks cold or heartless. In reality, it often looks calm. It looks steady. There is no dramatic speech. There is no emotional explosion. Forward. There is simply less energy flowing toward the person who once controlled so much of your attention. Forward. This is one reason emotional detachment can be difficult for a narcissistic person to understand. Many narcissistic relationships follow a pattern that repeats itself over and over. Forward. At first, there is excitement. Attention feels endless. Compliments feel powerful. The connection seems unique. Then the relationship slowly shifts. Approval becomes less predictable. Forward. Criticism appears more often. Affection may become inconsistent. Moments of closeness are followed by distance. This cycle creates emotional uncertainty. Forward. Psychologists have studied this pattern for years. Forward. One reason it feels so powerful is that unpredictable rewards can create stronger emotional attachment than rewards that arrive every time. Forward. When affection appears and disappears without warning, many people become more focused on earning it again. They work harder. They think harder. They worry more. Without realizing it, forward, their emotional world begins revolving around someone else's reactions. This is where control quietly enters the relationship. Control is not always loud. Forward. It does not always involve threats or commands. Sometimes it appears through much smaller behaviors. A disappointed look, delayed replies, unexpected praise after criticism. Forward. Sudden distance after moments of closeness. Tiny emotional signals slowly shape another person's behavior. Over time, many people stop making decisions based on what feels healthy. Forward. Instead, they begin making decisions based on avoiding conflict or gaining approval. That shift is easy to miss. Forward. One lesser known fact is that control often becomes strongest when it feels invisible. If someone openly announces that they want complete control over another person, forward, most people would recognize the danger. But emotional control usually develops through repeated interactions that seem ordinary when viewed one at a time. Forward. Only later does the larger pattern become clear. A narcissistic personality often depends heavily on predictable emotional responses from other people. That does not mean every narcissistic person consciously plans every interaction. Human behavior is much more complicated than that. Many patterns operate almost automatically. They become habits built over years. Predictability creates stability. When a certain comment always creates guilt, that response becomes expected. When criticism always produces apologies, that becomes expected. When withdrawal always causes someone to chase after the relationship, that becomes expected. The emotional system begins working almost like a script. Then something unexpected happens. The script suddenly changes. The apology never comes. The argument never begins. The emotional reaction never appears. The person who once chased approval simply remains calm. That calmness creates uncertainty. For someone who depends on emotional influence, uncertainty can feel deeply uncomfortable. Researchers often describe narcissistic traits as involving a strong need for admiration, recognition, or validation. These needs can vary greatly from one individual to another. Some people display obvious grandiosity. Others appear shy, sensitive, or even humble while still relying heavily on outside approval. This is one reason narcissism is often misunderstood. It is not always loud. It is not always confident. It is not always easy to recognize. Sometimes the strongest need for validation hides behind charm, success, kindness, or vulnerability. That hidden side surprises many people. Another important point is that losing influence over someone is not simply losing an argument. It represents something much deeper. Influence provides reassurance. It confirms that words still matter, that emotions can still be shaped, that attention can still be directed. When that influence begins disappearing, the emotional balance inside the relationship changes. This does not automatically mean panic. It does not automatically mean rage. Every individual responds differently. Personality exists on a spectrum. Life experiences matter. Emotional maturity matters. Mental health matters. Some people show only mild narcissistic traits. Others meet the criteria for a personality disorder. Their reactions will not all be the same. That distinction is extremely important. The purpose of understanding these patterns is not to place labels on everyone who behaves selfishly. It is not to encourage suspicion toward every difficult relationship. Instead, it helps explain why certain behaviors appear again and again across many unhealthy dynamics. Patterns are not guarantees. They are tendencies. Some narcissistic individuals become angry when emotional control fades. Others become unusually kind. Some withdraw completely. Others continue returning months or even years later. The behavior changes, but the underlying goal often remains connected to restoring influence or protecting a fragile sense of self. Understanding this difference prevents one of the biggest mistakes people make. They focus only on the behavior. They miss the pattern beneath it. As the emotional distance grows, something begins happening beneath the surface that many people never recognize until much later. The familiar strategies stop producing familiar results. The emotional balance starts shifting. For the first time in a long time, the person who once seemed completely confident is forced to respond to a situation they no longer fully control. And that is where the next stage begins. The first sign that something has changed is often not seen by the person breaking free. It is noticed by the narcissist. For a long time, the relationship followed a familiar rhythm. Forward. Certain words created guilt. Certain accusations started long conversations. A period of silence usually brought you back. A compliment repaired the damage after harsh criticism. Forward. The pattern became predictable. Human beings naturally learn from repeated experiences. The brain constantly looks for patterns. Forward. When one action produces the same result again and again, the brain begins to expect that result. This happens in healthy relationships as well. Forward. We all develop expectations based on past interactions. Forward. In narcissistic relationships, those expectations can become deeply tied to emotional control. A narcissistic person may expect that criticism will make you defend yourself. Forward. They may expect that pulling away will make you chase them. They may expect that praise will quickly erase painful memories. Forward. They may expect that blame will leave you questioning your own judgment. These expectations are not always carefully planned. Many become automatic over time. Forward. Then something unexpected happens. The familiar reaction never comes. You do not rush to explain yourself. You do not argue for hours. You do not send long emotional messages. Forward. You do not beg for another chance. You simply remain calm. That calmness creates a problem. From the outside, it may look like nothing happened. Inside the psychological dynamic, forward, almost everything has changed. Many people think emotional control depends on power. In reality, it often depends on predictability. If someone knows exactly how you will react, forward, influencing your behavior becomes much easier. Every emotional response becomes part of a familiar cycle. Once that cycle breaks, uncertainty takes its place. Forward. Psychologists often describe uncertainty as something the human mind naturally wants to reduce. We search for explanations, we look for patterns, we try to restore order. Forward. This tendency becomes even stronger when someone feels their influence slipping away. That is why the first stage is often shock rather than acceptance. Forward. The old strategy suddenly stops producing the old result. One lesser-known fact is that the absence of emotion can communicate more than intense emotion. Forward. A heated argument still shows investment. Tears still show attachment. Even frustration signals that the relationship still occupies a large space in your emotional world. Forward. Calm indifference sends a completely different message. It quietly says that your emotional center no longer depends on their behavior. Forward. For someone who built the relationship around predictable emotional reactions, this shift can feel deeply unsettling. There is another difference that many people overlook. Forward. Pretending not to care is not the same as truly not caring. Someone who is pretending often watches every move. They hope the other person notices. They secretly wait for a reaction. Forward. They still feel emotionally connected, even if they hide it well. Real detachment looks different. Forward. There is no performance. There is no hidden competition. There is no need to prove strength. Life simply begins moving forward. Must are answered only when necessary. Forward. Silence no longer feels like punishment. Attention naturally shifts toward work, family, hobbies, personal growth, and inner peace. Ironically, forward, genuine detachment is often much quieter than fake detachment. A narcissistic person frequently senses this difference, not because they can read minds. Forward. Because behavior changes in small but consistent ways. Your voice sounds calmer, your decisions become firmer, your boundaries remain steady. You stop explaining every choice. Forward. You stop reacting to every criticism. Those small changes reveal much more than dramatic speeches ever could. Forward. Another surprising detail is that many people expect anger to be the strongest response after emotional control weakens. Very often, confusion comes first. Forward. The narcissist may test the situation without even realizing it. A casual message appears, a small joke, an unexpected compliment, a simple question. Forward. These interactions may seem ordinary on the surface, but they often serve another purpose. They measure whether the old emotional connection still exists. Forward. If your response follows the old pattern, the system feels familiar again. If your response stays calm and emotionally balanced, uncertainty grows. Forward. That uncertainty can become surprisingly uncomfortable. Think about any routine that suddenly changes without warning. You expect a light switch to turn on the lights. Forward. One day it does nothing. Most people press it again, then again. Not because they enjoy repeating the action, because the expected result disappeared. Forward. Relationships built around emotional predictability often work in a similar way. Old behaviors get repeated because they worked before. When they stop working, forward, the person using them often becomes increasingly uncertain. Another reason emotional neutrality feels so powerful is that it removes emotional fuel. Forward. Conflict needs two active participants. Manipulation depends on emotional engagement. Power struggles require resistance. When one person refuses to feed the cycle, forward, the entire dynamic begins losing energy. This does not mean becoming emotionless. It means choosing where your emotional energy goes. That choice changes everything. Forward. Researchers who study interpersonal behavior often point out that attention itself can become a powerful form of reinforcement. Forward. People naturally repeat behaviors that consistently produce rewarding outcomes. When emotional reactions disappear, the reward system changes as well. The expected payoff is gone. Forward. For many narcissistic personalities, validation functions like psychological confirmation. It reassures them that they still matter. Forward. That they still influence the emotional world around them. When your reactions become smaller, that confirmation weakens. The predictable source of validation slowly disappears. Forward. This can create an uncomfortable gap between expectation and reality. Instead of feeling certain, they begin searching for answers. Instead of assuming control, they begin testing it. Forward. Instead of relying on old patterns, they start looking for new ones. Forward. And that search often marks the beginning of a dramatic shift in behavior that catches many people completely off guard. Once the old patterns stop working, forward, many narcissistic individuals do not immediately give up. They adapt. This is the stage that catches many people by surprise. Forward. The person who barely answered your messages suddenly contacts you every day. The person who dismissed your feelings suddenly wants to listen. Forward. The person who seemed emotionally distant suddenly becomes warm, caring, and affectionate. At first, it feels confusing. Forward. Then it becomes tempting to believe that everything has finally changed. But psychology often tells a more complicated story. Human behavior is driven by results. Forward. When one strategy stops producing the desired outcome, people naturally try another. This is true in everyday life. A different route to work. A different way of solving a problem. Forward. A different approach during a difficult conversation. The same principle can appear in unhealthy relationships. If criticism no longer creates guilt, another method may replace it. Forward. If distance no longer makes you chase them, closeness may suddenly appear. If silence loses its power, constant attention may take its place. The behavior changes. Forward. The goal often does not. This is why sudden kindness should be viewed carefully rather than emotionally. Kindness itself is not suspicious. Forward. Genuine people become kinder because they care. The difference lies in consistency and purpose. Is the kindness steady over time? Forward. Does it continue even when it does not produce immediate rewards? Does it come with accountability for past behavior? Or does it disappear the moment emotional control returns? Forward. Those questions reveal much more than grand romantic gestures. Forward. One lesser-known fact is that people are often influenced more strongly by unpredictable rewards than predictable ones. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. Forward. It sounds technical, but the idea is simple. When positive experiences arrive randomly instead of consistently, the brain pays even more attention. Forward. This pattern appears in many parts of life. It explains why people keep checking for notifications, why games become addictive, why uncertain rewards can feel unusually exciting. Forward. Relationships can follow a similar pattern. Long periods of criticism may suddenly be interrupted by intense affection. Coldness becomes warmth. Distance becomes closeness. Forward. Neglect becomes attention. Those brief positive moments feel incredibly powerful because they are rare. Instead of asking why the behavior changed. Forward. Many people focus on the hope that the good version of the relationship has finally returned. Hope is one of the strongest emotional forces in human psychology. Forward. It encourages people to stay longer, to forgive faster, to ignore warning signs, to believe that this time will be different. Forward. That hope can become even stronger after emotional detachment begins. The narcissistic person senses the growing distance. The response becomes bigger, more messages. Forward. More compliments, more promises, more emotional conversations. Sometimes there are unexpected gifts. Sometimes there are heartfelt apologies. Forward. Sometimes there are dramatic declarations about changing forever. These moments often feel deeply convincing because they arrive exactly when you have started letting go. Forward. Timing matters. Many people mistake perfect timing for perfect sincerity. That mistake can restart the entire cycle. Not every apology is manipulative. Forward. People are capable of real growth. They can recognize harmful behavior. They can seek therapy. They can accept responsibility without making excuses. Forward. They can change over months and years through consistent effort. Real change exists, but real change also leaves evidence. It does not depend on emotional emergencies. Forward. It does not disappear after a few weeks. It remains visible even when no one is watching. Forward. That is an important distinction. Another common shift appears in the form of guilt. Instead of attacking directly, the conversation becomes emotional. Forward. They remind you of shared memories. They speak about loneliness. They describe how much they sacrificed. They suggest that you are giving up too easily. Forward. Sometimes they speak as though they are the true victim. This approach works because guilt activates empathy. Forward. Many caring people naturally place other people's needs ahead of their own. A narcissistic personality may consciously or unconsciously rely on that tendency. Forward. If guilt succeeds where criticism failed, guilt becomes the new strategy. If guilt fails, another approach may quickly replace it. Sometimes the warmth disappears overnight. Forward. The compliments become insults. Affection becomes rejection. Calm conversations become harsh criticism. This sudden shift leaves many people emotionally stunned. Forward. They ask themselves one painful question. Which version was real? The answer is often more complex than choosing one or the other. Forward. Both versions may be real expressions of the same underlying need. One seeks connection through reward. The other seeks influence through fear or self-doubt. Different methods. The same destination. Another surprising detail is that increased attention is not always proof of increased love. Sometimes attention increases because influence is decreasing. Those two things are not the same. A person who truly respects you also respects your boundaries. A person focused mainly on restoring control often respects boundaries only until they become inconvenient. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Anyone can behave differently for a short period. Lasting character is revealed over time. Pataws speak louder than emotional moments. Researchers who study personality often note that deeply rooted behavior patterns usually change slowly. Lasting psychological change requires self-awareness, accountability, willingness to accept uncomfortable truths, and repeated effort. Quick emotional shifts alone rarely transform long-established habits. That reality can be difficult to accept because dramatic moments feel meaningful. The brain naturally remembers emotional highs more vividly than quiet stability. A single weekend filled with affection can overshadow months of disrespect. One heartfelt conversation can temporarily erase countless warning signs. That is exactly why this stage becomes so confusing. Your emotions begin saying one thing. The overall pattern says something else. Learning to separate those two voices becomes one of the most important skills in breaking unhealthy cycles. As the familiar tactics continue losing their power, another battle quietly begins beneath the surface. It is no longer only about changing your behavior. It is also about protecting a self-image that suddenly feels far less secure than it once did. The biggest battle is often not happening between you and the narcissist. It is happening inside the narcissist's own mind. From the outside, many narcissistic people appear completely confident. They speak with certainty. They rarely admit mistakes. They may act as though criticism means nothing to them. They project strength. They project certainty. They project success. But psychology has uncovered a much more complicated reality. Confidence and narcissism are not the same thing. Healthy confidence grows from a stable sense of self. A confident person can usually accept disagreement without feeling destroyed by it. They can admit mistakes without believing they have lost all value. They can hear criticism, think about it, and decide whether it is fair or unfair. Their identity remains steady because it is built from within rather than borrowed from other people. That kind of confidence does not need constant proof. A narcissistic personality often operates differently. For many people with strong narcissistic traits, self-esteem depends much more heavily on outside feedback. Praise becomes more than encouragement. Admiration becomes more than kindness. Attention becomes more than simple interest. These things become psychological fuel. When that fuel is flowing, everything appears normal. When it suddenly disappears, something begins to crack beneath the surface. One lesser-known fact is that psychologists sometimes describe narcissistic self-esteem as unstable rather than simply high. That may sound surprising because narcissistic people often appear extremely self-assured. The appearance can be misleading. Their self-worth may rise quickly after admiration. It may also fall sharply after rejection. This constant dependence on outside validation creates a fragile emotional system. Think of two buildings standing side by side. One rests on solid rock. The other rests on thin ice. From a distance, both buildings look equally strong. Forward. Only pressure reveals the difference. When emotional influence disappears, pressure increases. That is why indifference often creates such a powerful reaction. Forward. Many people expect rejection to hurt because it ends a relationship. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, rejection can feel like something even deeper. Forward. It can threaten the image they have carefully built. Psychologists often use the term narcissistic injury to describe this experience. Despite the dramatic name, forward, it does not refer to a physical wound. It refers to psychological pain caused by damage to a person's self-image. The trigger does not always need to be harsh criticism. Forward. Sometimes calm indifference creates the strongest injury. Your anger still says they matter. Your sadness still says they matter. Your endless explanations still say they matter. Forward. Your emotional peace quietly says something else. It says that your world no longer revolves around them. For someone who depends on being emotionally important, forward, that message can feel deeply threatening. This does not mean every narcissistic person consciously thinks these exact thoughts. Forward. Much of human psychology works below conscious awareness. Defense mechanisms often activate automatically. Forward. Defense mechanisms are the mind's way of protecting itself from emotional pain. Everyone uses them to some degree. Forward. The difference lies in how often they appear and how strongly they shape behavior. One common defense is denial. Instead of accepting that someone genuinely moved on, forward, the narcissistic person convinces themselves that you are pretending. Another defense is projection. Instead of recognizing their own insecurity, they accuse you of being insecure. Forward. Instead of admitting their own need for control, they claim that you are controlling. The uncomfortable feeling inside gets assigned to someone else. Forward. This reduces emotional discomfort, at least for a while. Another powerful defense involves rewriting the story. Mirror is not a perfect recording device. It is surprisingly flexible. Forward. People naturally remember events in ways that support the story they tell themselves. When protecting self-esteem becomes extremely important, this process can become even stronger. Forward. Suddenly, the relationship is remembered differently. Your sacrifices become invisible, their mistakes become smaller, your reactions become the main problem. Forward. Their behavior becomes justified. This rewritten version of events allows the self-image to survive without requiring painful self-examination. Forward. That is one reason conversations after a breakup often feel so confusing. You remember one history, they describe another. Both people may genuinely believe their version, forward, but one version often serves an important psychological purpose. It protects identity. Another surprising detail is that accepting responsibility requires emotional security. Forward. A person must first believe that making a mistake does not destroy their value as a human being. Healthy confidence allows room for failure. Fragile self-worth often does not. Forward. If admitting fault feels emotionally unbearable, the mind begins searching for another explanation. Someone else must be responsible. Circumstances must be unfair. Forward. The timing must be wrong. The partner must be impossible to satisfy. Anything becomes easier than facing deep shame. Forward. Shame plays a much larger role in narcissistic psychology than many people realize. Most people think narcissism is built only on pride. In reality, forward, many experts believe hidden shame often exists beneath the surface. That shame rarely appears openly. Instead, it hides behind superiority. It hides behind perfection. Forward. It hides behind constant comparison. It hides behind the need to always appear successful, intelligent, attractive, or important. Forward. When your emotional detachment removes a source of validation, those hidden feelings may become much harder to ignore. This explains why some reactions appear so disproportionate. Forward. A simple boundary creates intense anger. A calm refusal creates harsh criticism. A quiet goodbye creates relentless attempts to pull you back. Forward. The behavior may seem confusing until you understand the emotional threat underneath it. The goal is often not simply winning an argument. Forward. The goal is restoring a damaged sense of self. That difference changes the way every action is understood. Instead of asking why they suddenly became so kind or so angry, forward. Another question becomes far more revealing. What part of their identity feels threatened by losing influence? Forward. Once that question begins guiding your thinking, many behaviors that once seemed random start fitting together like pieces of a much larger puzzle. And as that puzzle becomes clearer, forward, the next stage begins to unfold, because eventually every narcissistic person reaches a point where they must decide whether to keep fighting for lost influence, forward, find a new source of validation, or reshape the story in a way that allows them to move forward without ever admitting what was truly lost. Time changes many relationships. Forward. It also changes the way a narcissistic person responds after realizing that emotional control is slipping away. The first reactions are often intense, but as weeks turn into months, forward, a different pattern usually begins to appear. There is no single ending. Instead, there are several paths. Which path someone takes often depends on one important question. Forward. Do they believe they can still regain influence over you? If the answer is yes, they may continue trying. If the answer is no, their attention may slowly move somewhere else. Forward. One of the most common long-term responses is searching for a new source of validation. Psychologists sometimes use the term narcissistic supply to describe the attention, forward, admiration, praise, or emotional reactions that help support a narcissistic person's self-image. This supply can come from romantic partners, family members, friends, co-workers, forward, or even social media audiences. It is not always about love. Very often, it is about emotional confirmation. So someone new may enter their life surprisingly fast. To outsiders, forward, this can look like complete recovery. It may even appear that the previous relationship meant very little. The reality is often more complicated. Forward. Starting another relationship does not automatically resolve the emotional issues that existed before. A new person may simply provide a fresh source of admiration and attention. Forward. For a while, everything looks exciting again. The cycle appears to restart. The compliments return. The charm returns. The confidence returns. Forward. But if the deeper patterns remain unchanged, the same emotional dynamics may slowly develop once again. Another response is much more confusing. Months pass, sometimes even years. Forward. Then suddenly a message appears. It may seem casual, a simple greeting, a birthday wish, a question that could easily have been answered by someone else. Forward. A comment about an old memory. Nothing seems dramatic, yet the timing often feels strangely deliberate. Many people become confused because they believed everything was over. Forward. Why return after so much time? The answer is not always the same. Sometimes people genuinely want closure. Sometimes they sincerely regret past behavior. Forward. Human beings are capable of reflection and growth, but In relationships involving strong narcissistic traits, another possibility also exists. The message may serve as a test. Forward. Not necessarily a test plan in detail. Sometimes it is simply an attempt to discover whether emotional influence still exists. Will you respond quickly? Forward. Will old emotions return? Will familiar conversations begin again? Even a small interaction can provide information. If the emotional connection appears weak, forward, they may disappear once more. If it appears strong, communication may increase. This repeated return often surprises people because they mistake time for transformation. Forward. Time alone does not change deeply rooted behavioral patterns. Growth requires self-awareness, accountability, consistent effort. Without those elements, forward, the same dynamics often reappear under different circumstances. Another possible outcome involves protecting public image. Forward. This can become especially important when losing the relationship threatens the way the narcissistic person wants to be seen. Instead of processing private disappointment, forward, attention shifts toward reputation. Friends may hear a different version of the story. Family members may receive selective details. Forward. Social media suddenly presents an unusually perfect life. Success becomes more visible. Happiness becomes more visible. Confidence becomes more visible. Forward. One lesser-known fact is that image management often becomes stronger during periods of emotional insecurity. Forward. The outside appearance grows brighter while the internal discomfort remains hidden. Sometimes this develops into a smear campaign. Forward. Not every narcissistic person engages in this behavior, but when it happens, the goal is often similar: protect the self-image. If admitting responsibility feels too threatening, forward, another explanation becomes necessary. The former partner becomes unreasonable, too sensitive, too demanding, impossible to satisfy. Forward. These stories may sound convincing because they contain small pieces of truth mixed with larger distortions. Forward. That combination makes them difficult to challenge. People naturally believe stories that sound balanced. This is why smear campaigns can become emotionally exhausting. Forward. Many people feel an overwhelming urge to defend themselves, to correct every false statement, to explain every detail. Ironically, forward, endless self-defense often keeps the emotional connection alive. Meanwhile, the narcissistic person continues shaping the narrative. Forward. There is another outcome that many people misunderstand: complete withdrawal. One day, communication simply stops. No messages, no attempts to reconnect, no visible anger, nothing. Forward. Some people assume this means healing has taken place. Not necessarily. Silence can have many meanings. Sometimes it reflects acceptance. Sometimes it reflects exhaustion. Forward. Sometimes it reflects the discovery of a new source of validation. Sometimes it reflects the realization that emotional influence cannot be restored. Forward. The outside behavior may look peaceful while the inner motivation remains unchanged. That is why behavior alone rarely tells the full story. Forward. A quiet ending does not automatically mean emotional growth. Likewise, continued contact does not automatically prove obsession. Human behavior is rarely that simple. Forward. Another important point often gets overlooked. Not everyone with narcissistic traits responds in the same way. Some people display only mild characteristics. Forward. Others show much stronger patterns. Life experiences matter. Age matters. Emotional maturity matters. Professional treatment can matter. Personal motivation matters. Forward. Two individuals with similar traits may respond very differently to the same situation. This is why psychology speaks in patterns rather than guarantees. Forward. Patterns help us recognize possibilities. They do not predict every person's future. Understanding these differences protects against another common mistake. Forward. People sometimes spend years trying to predict the narcissist's next move. Will they return? Will they apologize? Will they become angry? Will they move on? Forward. Those questions feel important, but they slowly place your attention back where it used to be, on them. The healthier question gradually becomes something else. Forward. Whether they return or disappear, whether they praise you or criticize you, whether they tell the truth or rewrite the past, none of those choices determine your emotional freedom. Forward. The real turning point begins when their next move is no longer the center of your life. And that shift leads to the most powerful lesson of all. Forward. Because the greatest change in this entire story does not happen inside the narcissist. Forward. It happens inside the person who finally learns that peace becomes possible. The moment emotional independence replaces the need for someone else's approval. Forward. The greatest surprise in this entire process is that your strongest response is often the quietest one. Many people believe power comes from the perfect argument. Forward. They search for the perfect words. They replay old conversations in their minds. Forward. They hope that one final explanation will finally make the narcissist understand the damage they caused. That moment rarely arrives, not because your feelings lack value. Forward. Because someone who is focused on protecting their self-image may not be ready to receive those feelings in the way you hope. Real change begins somewhere else. Forward. It begins when your emotional stability no longer depends on another person's approval, attention, or opinion. This is emotional independence. Forward. It does not mean becoming emotionally closed. It does not mean refusing to trust people again. It does not mean pretending that painful experiences never happened. Forward. It means your peace no longer rises and falls according to someone else's behavior. That single change transforms the entire relationship. For a long time, forward, every message may have shaped your mood. Every criticism stayed in your thoughts for hours. Every compliment brought temporary relief. Every period of silence created anxiety. Forward. Without realizing, another person became responsible for your emotional weather. Then something changes. Their silence remains silent. Their criticism remains criticism. Forward. Their praise remains praise. But your inner world becomes steadier. The external event stays the same. Your response becomes different. That difference is where real freedom begins. Forward. One important lesson from psychology is that there is a difference between reacting and responding. A reaction is usually immediate. It grows from emotion. Forward. Someone says something hurtful. You instantly defend yourself. Someone ignores you. You immediately demand an explanation. Someone blames you unfairly. Forward. You rush to prove your innocence. Reactions are fast. They often happen before careful thinking. A response is different. Forward. A response includes a pause. Not because you are weak, because you are choosing your direction instead of allowing another person to choose it for you. Forward. That small pause is surprisingly powerful. Forward. Researchers who study emotional regulation have found that creating even a brief space between a trigger and a response can improve decision-making. Instead of acting from fear, forward, guilt, or anger, people become more capable of choosing actions that match their long-term values rather than their immediate emotions. That skill changes relationships. Forward. A narcissistic person often expects familiar reactions. The old pattern says, Criticism will produce self-defense. Silence will produce pursuit. Blame will produce guilt. Forward. When those reactions disappear, the emotional script begins falling apart. Another powerful tool is the boundary. Many people misunderstand boundaries. Forward. They think a boundary is something that controls another person. It is not. A boundary controls your own actions. It answers a simple question. Forward. What will I do if this behavior continues? That makes boundaries very different from threats. A threat tries to force someone else to change. A boundary explains your own decision. Forward. For example, refusing to continue a conversation filled with insults is a boundary. Leaving a room when shouting begins is a boundary. Forward. Choosing not to answer repeated manipulative messages is a boundary. These actions are not punishment. They are protection. Forward. One lesser-known fact is that manipulation becomes much harder when boundaries remain consistent. Manipulation depends on uncertainty. If your limits change every week, forward, another person keeps testing them. If your limits remain calm, respectful, and consistent, there is much less room for emotional bargaining. Consistency removes confusion. Forward. Confusion often creates opportunity. This does not mean boundaries always produce peace immediately. Sometimes the opposite happens. Forward. People who benefited from weak boundaries often resist strong ones. That resistance can appear as anger, as guilt, as blame, as sudden affection. Forward. As promises that everything will be different. The boundary is working precisely because it reveals which behaviors depended on unrestricted access to your emotions. Forward. Healing also changes the questions you ask yourself. At the beginning, many people ask the same painful questions. Why did they do this? Will they change? Forward. Will they finally understand? Will they regret losing me? Those questions keep your attention locked onto the other person. As recovery grows, different questions begin to appear. Forward. How do I rebuild my confidence? How do I trust my own judgment again? What kind of relationships make me feel safe? What values do I want guiding my future? Forward. Notice how the focus shifts. The center of your life slowly returns to where it belongs to you. That shift is often gradual. Some days feel strong. Forward. Other days bring old memories back. Healing rarely moves in a straight line. Psychologists often describe recovery as a process rather than a single breakthrough. Forward. Progress comes through many small decisions repeated over time. One calm conversation, one healthy boundary, one evening without checking for a message. Forward. One choice to invest your energy in people who respect you. Those small victories quietly reshape your emotional life. Forward. Another surprising truth is that genuine recovery is usually less dramatic than people expect. There is no magical morning when every painful memory disappears. Instead, forward, one day you notice something unexpected. You forgot to think about them for several hours, then for an entire day, later for an entire week. Forward. The emotional weight becomes lighter without you noticing exactly when it happened. That quiet freedom is far more valuable than winning an argument. Forward. Many people dream about proving the narcissist wrong, about exposing every lie, about making them finally admit the truth. Those victories often remain outside your control. Forward. Real recovery depends on something much more reliable, your own emotional freedom. Winning a debate may feel satisfying for a moment. Forward. Building a peaceful life changes every day that follows. The most powerful ending is not watching someone else change. It is realizing that their choices no longer determine yours. Forward. Their approval no longer defines your worth. Their rejection no longer defines your identity. Their presence no longer controls your peace. That is the moment the cycle truly begins to break. And once that happens, the question is no longer whether the narcissist realizes that you do not care anymore. The far more important realization is that you finally understand why your peace was never meant to depend on their reaction in the first place. The biggest lesson from this journey is surprisingly simple. Many people believe that the strongest way to affect a narcissist is through anger, confrontation, or proving them wrong. Yet psychology often points in another direction. For many narcissistic individuals, the moment that creates the greatest challenge is not when you fight harder. It is when your emotional dependence quietly disappears. That is the moment the old patterns begin to lose their power. Your peace no longer depends on their approval. Your confidence no longer rises and falls with their opinions. Your decisions no longer revolve around keeping them happy or avoiding their criticisms. That is a change no argument can create. Understanding these psychological patterns is not about judging people. It is not about labeling everyone who hurts you.